This video is going to analyze the idea of folklore and the holobiont, the host and microbiome relationship, along with mental disorders. This take on mental disorders is going to be different and may upset some people, so if nothing else, just think of it as a thought experiment. For the time being, pretend that psychiatry and the DSM-5 haven't been invented, that mental disorders as a concept don't exist. I'll introduce those again later, but for now all we have is folklore and microbiology. For this example, we're going to take the worst serial killer in history and we're going to show a picture of them to a 15th century farmer or someone from 200 BC, or really any great-grandparent. Their reaction is likely going to be some gesture of religious protection and calling them the name of some local folk creature of legend. Whether it's a wendigo or a changeling, strigoi, djinn, yokai, or any number of shape-shifting spirits capable of malefic possession. Before these folk creatures took on physical characteristics as we depict them now, they were spirits whose agency could move between objects, people, plants, animals, anything of that sort. That same kind of spirit could be identified in a dog that randomly went feral and bit someone. So this is what I mean by the psychospiritual. Rabies is probably a good way to understand this concept. The genus of viruses that cause rabies is called Lyssavirus. Lyssavirus is the Greek goddess of madness, frenzy, and rabies. This gives us a clear personification of a psychospiritual condition that we've maintained the ancient nomenclature of. But before we continue with folklore, we need to understand where microbiome studies, theories, and research is at. The first and possibly most important point is that microbes are intelligent, decision-making, and social organisms. They have receptors that give them information about the environment they're in, and they form complex communities that behave much like a brain. Some microbes have far more receptors than others. These organisms and communities are adaptable, and they can change their genes, influence the genes of neighboring organisms, as well as even the host organism. The second point is microbes can communicate with the host through three main channels: the endocrine, the neural, and the immune, all of which can affect mood, behavior, and personality. They also play a role in developing and training these systems from the embryo onward. The third point is the microbes associated with humans have been the same ones with humans for millennia. Otzi the Iceman had bacterial DNA that was preserved, and it was found to have a lot in common with people living in rural areas. It shared even more in common with modern hunter-gatherer tribes. Ancient Egyptians suffered from the same tuberculosis-causing bacteria that still affects people today. Likewise, Toxoplasma gondii was also found in Egyptian mummies. The fourth point is genetics play a large role in the composition of your microbiome. Other factors are what you'd expect: lifestyle, diet, geographic location, and environment. Both nature and nurture affect the microbiome, which includes mental health, which we'll get to in a minute. If you take two different groups of hunter-gatherers from different parts of the world, their microbiomes are more similar to each other than their agricultural or urban neighbors. Twins living in two different parts of the world also have very similar microbiomes. People from urban environments also share a lot in common, even if they're in different parts of the world. Point 5 is that there's no universal ideal microbiome. There's of course been studies into certain specific disease-causing microbes and ones that are beneficial. So there's never going to be a standard microbiome. However, the most important factor for health seems to be diversity of species. There's a person who studied his own microbiome, and he went on a diet of fast food for 2 weeks. What he found was that he lost 40% of his diversity. Reintroducing healthy and different foods helped to replenish that diversity. It seems pretty much any demographic after about 2 weeks can alter significant portions of their microbiome through diet. Point 6 is that those communication channels go both ways, and here we'll briefly reintroduce mental disorders. Baby rats that were separated from their mothers went through a lot of stress, obviously, and this damaged their microbiomes. They then gave those rats probiotics, and it relieved their stress. Researchers have also done bacterial transplants from one depressed rat to another, and the second rat would develop depression. The same results were found from many different disorders, whether they were physical disorders or mental disorders, such as schizophrenia, which they took from a person and gave it to a rat, and the rat developed the sort of rat equivalent to schizophrenia. Likewise, transplanting beneficial bacteria seems to alleviate many different disorders, including mental health problems. These are called FMTs and have actually existed since the 4th century China. In that case, it was actually made into a dish called yellow soup, and they would eat it to treat things like diarrhea. But FMTs have seen a lot of success, especially with really severe cases of autism, in alleviating many different symptoms. So not only can your mental health change your microbiome, the microbiome can change your mental health. It goes both ways. The general term for a problem with the microbiome is dysbiosis. Point 7 is generational microbes. Not only does your health history play a big role in your microorganisms, but so does your generational history. For example, lifelong use of antibiotics can damage the microbiome. In rats, they did a study to decrease the diversity of food in their diets. What they found was after 4 generations of this diet, they had permanently destroyed some of the diversity of the rat, meaning when they tried to reintroduce new foods, the diversity didn't return. The implications are, of course, being studied for humans. So in some cases, diversity never returns when it's depleted completely. Now we can start to get back into folklore with the idea of ancestral connections and ancestral consequences or sins that can haunt descendants. Considering all the points just listed, there's a way that ancestry and previous generations can impact future generations through the microbiome. Microbial communities are passed down through possessions and objects, through pets or livestock or agriculture or tools, or even yeast fermentation starters and other fermentation microbial communities. So all those generationally passed down objects contained the living communities that their ancestors interacted with. For some perspective on the uniqueness, you can take a computer keyboard or a phone and identify the owner by matching the microbes on both, basically like a fingerprint. Multi-generational trauma, such as with the Irish famine, saw that those extreme conditions led to the deactivation of certain genes. Those genes still lead to increased chances of obesity, cardiovascular disease, depression, and schizophrenia. Calamities like that, which many cultures have gone through, devastate ancestral microbiomes, which leads to problems extending into future generations, such as with the second point. Taking away those co-evolved microbial communities, either through extreme hardships, antibiotic use, or just poor diet, and you have a pathway for genetic illnesses, as well as just general health issues and predispositions to disease. But that also gives us a potential way to recover and heal from those generational issues. Autoimmune diseases are often genetic, but autoimmune diseases are unheard of in hunter-gatherer tribes. Now they face their own potential health issues, but this shows us that genes are not some randomly mutating thing. A lot of it depends on the microbiome. So that through the microbiome, we can probably figure out how to cure many different autoimmune diseases and generational illnesses. I know that was a lot of information, but we can finally come back and combine folklore, mental health, and the holobiont. The holobiont is an experimental view of humans seen collectively with their microbiome, including the genome of the host and the genome of the microbiome. In folk philosophy, many people or objects are seen with a similar description as the holobiont. They may be referred to as an entity. So that's why the serial killer at the beginning would be identified with a folk creature, because an understanding or impression exists of this sick person that they're possessed on a psycho-spiritual level, what I believe is the microbial or the microbiome. In folklore, people, objects, or places are referred to based off of that psycho-spiritual condition. If a person or place is seen as haunted, collectively there's enough going wrong with it. Essentially, the holobiont of that person or place is corrupted. I promised I'd return to mental disorders, so in the case of psychiatry and the DSM-5, we can look at it in a new light. Mental health is diagnosed usually through development, behavior, and sometimes through neurology. Mental disorders are defining symptoms. Take someone with autism. They can be tested for their behavior and determined to be autistic. This doesn't indicate any cause or source. The diagnosis is simply a description of side effects, because mental disorders aren't just your brain or your behavior or personality. It's the entirety of your organism, the holobiont. Mental disorders could be possession, but they could also be gifts from the gods or some divine source. But if your microbiome is different from birth, you're going to develop differently neurologically and personality-wise. so that some people could think differently or see things differently because they have a different microbiome that developed their system. But even so, that kind of dysbiosis could still lead to health problems. It's ultimately because mental health can affect the microbiome, and the microbiome can affect mental health, that it should be seen as the holobiont together. I know this was a lot of information, but